Hello everyone, today we talk about the Byzantine historical and strategic context between Odoacer and the rise of Justinian. So looking essentially at the imperial military during this important phase of, let's say, dissolution fundamentally of the western half of the empire and the military reinforcement of the remaining eastern half. And bridging this gap, focusing specifically on the Byzantine military, is crucial because fundamentally we see from one side the evaporation of the Western army and the essentially superimposition of the Ostrogothic force sent by the same Constantinople in Italy to overthrow Odoacer, and the premises for the same Justinian reconquest later on that would have not been possible if this mechanism had not been triggered. And it's an overlooked one. So the act with which the barbarian general had declared obedience to the Emperor of Constantinople, Zeno, after having deposed the Western one, Romulus Augustus, hadn't had, at least completely, the consequences that its author had hoped for. Odoacer had in fact chosen not to follow the policy adopted by other barbarian generalissimi that, once acquired the de facto power in the West, had created some puppet emperors to give kind of a formal best to their own role. A praxis that was consolidated by that point, but had constantly been subject to the unknowns deriving from the not always consensual reaction of Constantinople's court. Odoacer had thus preferred to take, say, more rational but also more original path compared to the romantic but generally utopistic, or at least, ever less practical visions of his predecessors that, in fact, had been developing and following one another within the context of the decay of Western imperial power, and putting an end to the western half of the empire as an autonomous entity, as it had administratively functioned since Theodosian times fundamentally, and thus recognizing the emperor of the eastern half, the authority on both partes, and proposing at the same time, himself, right, in the most humble but also the most solid and manageable representative of the imperial court and military commander in Italy, seemed objectively like a more viable choice. But the point is that Odoacer didn't fully control the entirety of the western half of the empire, and he had especially found on his way the cumbersome figure of Julius Nepos, Augustus of the West, since 474, and put to flight the following year by the general Orestes that had installed on the Western throne his son, would be Romulus Augustus, known as Augustulus, and with Nepos taking refuge in Dalmatia. Right, he was not the only figure, as you know, that remained in the West. It was famously enough Syagrius in the so-called kingdom of Soissons, eventually taken over by the Franks. But there were also other Roman successor states. For example, in northwest Africa, there were some Moorish powers who were still, part of the empire, were de facto continuing with that government, and also with some, ambition on their own. And speaking of course, of the West, the core of the empire had remained Italy. Gaul and Spain had been largely lost to the Federati, telling the truth, up to the 60s of the 5th century. Italy had had the resources to retake at least Spain, but the Vandals managed kind of, heroically to stand in between and ruin everything. In that, for that matter, not bowing not even to the Eastern Roman fleet, which had come to crush them. If it hadn't been for Gaiseric, fundamentally, any other Vandal king would have immediately surrendered, just like the Visigoths, in fact, were doing. But Nepos in Dalmatia is also, closer to the Byzantine world at that point. He was installed in Diocletian's palace in Split, right? So interestingly enough, right, a hell of a residence, as you know, so pretty well fortified. But he was de facto in a defiled position, right? Yet this was also a fundamental one de jure, because Zeno in Constantinople still recognized Nepos as legitimate Western emperor. And Odoacer, of course, was not claiming that. He was just, rendering back the imperial insignia to Constantinople. So it's something useful at that point for both, right, in this negotiational phase, especially considering that Constantinople has an influence on Nepos as well, and through that on the west still, but can also partially count on Odoacer. Odoacer found himself thus to be invested of the command of Italy by Constantinople, but at least in a formal way, still as a subordinate of Julius Nepos. And Zeno, in those years, was busy in crushing some usurpation attempt, so he had, frankly, other things to think about than that primarily. And he thus could not commit himself directly in the West, where the situation would resolve itself spontaneously within some year, as we will see. In fact, in 480, Julius Nepos, that was perhaps about to confront Odoacer himself, fell assassinated by an inside plot to his estate and the general of barbarian origin, Odoacer. At this point, any formal obstacle having fallen could extend his control also on the Dalmatian territories across the Adriatic, by the way. And it was only in this moment that the Western Roman Empire ceased to exist also formally as an administrative repartition. Not 476, but 480. Zeno began at this point a very delicate and complex internal policy aimed at managing the more powerful barbarian groups present within the imperial territory, trying mainly to put them repeatedly one against the other, which these peoples frankly were already quite prone to, because they inhabited mostly the Balkan hinterland south on the right bank of the Danube, and these were the populated areas where these peoples had mostly gathered, especially after the disgregation of Attila's empire, right, and had migrated south, but they were still pretty much unstable. Were a collection of many peoples that had been part of this broader movements and that were readjusting their own control in the area. And in 488, Zeno freed himself of the most important and frankly last one, right, of these groups. That was the made up by the Ostrogoths of Theodoric, by sending him famously in the west to attack Odoacer, right, with whom had always maintained rather ambiguous relations. This was a very good way to settle the matter, because the Ostrogoths were always kind of pressuring on some of the most important Greek urban centers. They were a pretty sizable group, some of the largest, in fact, of the migration era. They contained lots of other peoples, and Theodoric had been, some of the most Romanized kings, given that the Byzantines normally had nurtured, individuals like Alaric, Theodoric, this kind of monarchic direction of the Eastern Germans, that having been mixed with the Iranians, with the Huns, etc., had become kind of more like a steppe people, a bit more hierarchical in nature. So they had, from one side, this kind of greater social certification already to make them more politically, say, unitary is a big word, but let's say, in fact, hierarchically organized, and at the same time being still Germans, so not like the steppes peoples that were still basically incapable of settling anywhere of the territories of the former Roman Empire. So they were already acquainted to kind of de facto sedentary lifestyle, even though they were semi-nomadic in the sense they could put themselves on the march again, like in this context. And there was an important relation, as you know, between the Goths and Constantinopolitan court in this regard. It was a broader cultural one, but based on, of course, the federati military service for the empire, but also a more broad one, right? Properly an ethnological one. The Byzantines knew these peoples better than the others. These peoples also knew the Roman Empire better than the other Germans. And so Theodoric was a reliable figure that could essentially also provide with an important degree of power in Italy for, let's say, Constantinople. Be sure that no other upheavals in the peninsula would have occurred. Consider that there were other barbarian groups that were active and dangerous, right? The Vandals, also the Franks that were rising. The same Visigoths, after all, had could be, say, connected through the Ostrogothic link. So this was an important move that freed the Balkans from this other last mass population of hundreds of thousands. And this whole project was successful in many ways for all involved, practically, because Zeno resumed immediately the control of the Balkan territories freed by the Ostrogoths. So we're talking about Thrace and the Eastern Illyricum in practice. There was still an ambiguity on the Western Illyricum that did belong to the Western Roman Empire previously, and now, the Ostrogoths were kind of controlling. There was, on areas like Sirmium, Singidunum, also an important competition because of the Gepids and also other groups such as the Longobards were coming from the north. But the most important thing was securing Italy within, let's say, in a kind of proxy way, by making the Ostrogoths ruling there on behalf of Constantinople. This also meant, providing the papacy in Rome herself with some kind of stability. The first thing Theodoric does, even though he was an Arian, when he, as we will see now, he crushed Odoacer and killed him, was to go to Rome to revere the Pope, right? And as you know, the Ostrogoths in Italy realized the most successful Romano-Germanic cooperation to date in the migration era. So it was, I made videos about Ostrogothic Italy in general. And of course, there was a powerful barbarian Romano-Germanic kingdom fundamentally in Italy that was still it was replenished by the way of resources, especially of manpower, given that the Ostrogoths were a people in arms, and their deterrence was able to ransom, for example, Sicily, and putting the Vandals at bay a little, and so normalizing also the situation that had brought to the control, like the blackmail that the Vandals operated from Africa and partly the same Sicily by not making grain arriving in Rome, etc. So it was an important process for stabilizing the same power in Italy and keeping open also the trade routes with Constantinople, which were a big deal. Italy was still ruled by the Roman senators. Civilly speaking, the Goths basically controlled the army, resources, and so on. And in the rabbinate consistorium, Ostrogothic chieftains and Roman senators basically were on the same level by Theodoric's choice and will to rule in this fashion. So late antiquity was still there. The peninsula had not been destroyed. That would happen paradoxically because of Justinian's reconquest. But let's say at this point, given that none of that could be foreseen, or at least in a practical sense, at that moment, the final balance, the final cost-benefit ratio was substantially positive. When Zeno died in 491, the Roman Empire, albeit limited now to de facto direct control to the sole eastern half, had radically reduced in the latter, so in the factual center of imperial power, barbarian influence under any point of view, including the military one, resuming control on the totality of its own territory and of its own army. The latter aspect is relevant because the Roman army was never concretely Germanized. If anything, it was the other way around. The Germanic element was Romanized. The point, though, is that having a consistent amount of Germanic element within the army that can be, say, used, right, politically to make leverage within the same empire by a bulky people that stands just at your borders, on the frontier, and that requires also further resources to be put down, and so creating also the obvious connection, like with whom are these troops gonna stay, right? In the east as well as in the west, there were problems of usurpations. Think about Ardabur, Asper, these figures that were eventually massacred, and very often there is the idea that this was an anti-Germanic reaction. It is true, right? And it's probably, even though things were mishandled at the top political level in the West, in the let's say probably in the worst way, still the Germanic, say Romano-Germanic relations in the West were at the end of the day smoother than it seems, right? Also because there was more compenetration, definitely, and the same reason why the West basically dissolved within itself. It was not really because of a specific barbarian group or another, right? The same Odoacer was not at the head of a people, right? He just was at the head of the Italian army that was composed mainly by various Germanic mercenaries that were the kind of the most influent within still a local military organization with natives still made up the army, the garrisons, the militias, etc. In the East, there is a real xenophobia that is connected properly also to the Hellenic way, and that brought to entire massacres of Germans later on in an uncontrolled way. I made a video about Theodosius. I don't remember the title, but if you go in I think I created a Theodosian history Theodosian era playlist, and had to control these reactions. For example, exterminating the same responsibles for the anti-German massacres in Thessalonica, because at that time he relied heavily on the Goths, on base of which he had also say, developed his entire foreign strategic policy, right? The idea of Romans managing not to exterminate, but to defeat and Romanize and tame the Federati that made up an important part of the army. But this was surely mirroring this cumbersome presence, so that even though German elements remained always in the Byzantine army to stay, and there were also other repressions and difficulties with some, generals that were unruly and trying to, at that point, pursue, in fact, a career within the same Roman army. Getting rid of the Goths from the Balkans made this kind of all an inside thing, where still the ethnic majority was Roman, and where therefore there was not really a dependence on a foreign power, militarily wise. And this concept is underrated, because we tend to just think of the ethnic presence as a problem, whereas it was, of course, the political mass and leverage that was the problem. For the rest, Constantinople always hired troops of any possible ethnicity from everywhere that made up also, quite consistent part of the army. And it would always remain a kind of a Byzantine thing, where you can't even properly distinguish the two things. But enacting a balance that, as we will see now, begins a little bit at this point, because as we will see, the realization that trying just to counter these peoples that were at the end of the day succeeding one after the other in this avalanche coming mostly from the northeast. And so with peoples also, and fortunately at that point, they could not really settle within the empire, even when they came to be dangerous to the point they could destroy it, were still something different that also made them less effective in a way within, and kind of more culturally unacceptable for anyone living within the empire, including all the other ethnicities that entered regularly, were settled regularly all over the empire, which is also kind of underrated as a concept, right? I was explaining this in the video on the Varangian Guard, because mostly, kids click on that because they're obsessed with, video games, units with guys with double hand axes, but the actual thing was like an entire army that was made up by scattering Scandinavians, and people coming from who knows where, all over the empire, as also needing to serve as any type of trooper, mostly light ones, telling the truth, but still having that kind of manpower. That was an issue, an enormous issue, for which we will see now that war was trying always to be avoided with diplomacy, preferentially, because it was very costly in tributes and so on, but still, for fighting, you do need that force. And manpower at this point starts to become rare in the broader balance of this declining world, right? Even before the big contraction of the later centuries. Now, to Zeno, that was of Isaurian origins, and that already shows what the situation was within the empire. I mean, some peoples that had remained under Rome for half millennium, that were still unromanized in the wildest, more primitive interlands, but still providing with an important military force. At some point, these Aurians were put down because they were really like a pain in the behind. Succeeded Anastasius, who was an Hellenophone, let's say, who caused also the discontent of the Isaurian component within the army, right? So this triggered a rebellion that the new emperor managed to contain and in the following years to choke. But speaking again of internal, external foes, this came from the very within of the empire, not from a people arrived from who knows where. And Anastasius was crucial in the stabilization of the empire after this first difficulty. And first of all, as a ruler who was active in all fields, he, for example, enacted an effective monetary policy to improve the financial dynamics of the empire. And as far as the army that constituted one of the most expensive, not the most expensive branch of the state, as you know, substituted, at least in part, the payment in nature with monetary concessions, donatives, that una tantum, really, that the military could manage, thus with also a greater autonomy, right? This was crucial because the same barbarians with the tributes and the fetus wanted gold, right, and certified good, full Roman gold, right? So shifting the balance, let's say, from the outside to the within, in terms of those that this money would go to, would bring to the general effect of increasing the attractiveness that the military service exercised on the Roman subjects, bringing to, in fact, a meaningful numerical and also qualitative increase of the voluntary enlistment based on Roman and or at least people coming from within the boundaries of the same empire, right? And these measures contributed without any doubt to the coming back of a markedly native, autochthonous character within the army, right? Even though it's a big thing to say, considering the important ethnic complexity of the Byzantine Empire was greater than the West, because in the West you had essentially, like, if you exclude Africa, that was lost, like at least the most important one was captured by the Vandals. You had essentially a Latin and a Germanic component. Also the Celtic one at this point basically is blended in and comes from more peripheral areas. Not that there weren't, in fact, military forces not hired from there, and that would continue actually from throughout all the whole Middle Ages and even modern times, given that we were talking about that on the video on the mercenaries that we made a few days ago. But in Constantinople, it was probably the Byzantine system that was essentially this Hellenic base, coastal, inner coastal urban net, surrounded by lots of peoples all around that were quite diverse from one another, right? And quite also difficult to distinguish ethnically because of the superimposition of various populations in Asia Minor, in the Balkans. So in a way that would, of course, would be homogenized in that kind of ideal of Romania that already existed as such, and so the ecumenic, cosmopolitan, multicultural idea of that empire, but that from the de facto was much more blended ethnically, much more, in fact, mixed ethnically than what the West historically was, and where it was in fact mostly the Latin-Germanic dichotomy that prevailed as a dialect, a political, cultural dialect, as we've seen many times, and even there creating a synthesis, an undistinguishable one, but still for stressing the fact that talking about Roman, especially in the Byzantine East, if you look even at after these times, what the military organization of the empire was like, it was very composite, right? There hadn't been properly a military reform at this point of the various elements that make up the army. If you look at, I don't know, Justinian, the armies of the Justinian era Reconquest, right? They were heavily multi-ethnic, right? It wasn't really like a markedly hardcore, professional, permanent bulk of ethnic whatever. If you can think of Greeks, maybe. It was something radically mixed. There were Germans, there were Turks, there were Huns, there were Moors. It was terrifying in a sense, but it was still functional, proving that probably these early this previous reforms dating to Anastasius' time, by managing to restructure at least the supply system and the paying system of the army, had brought to that center would remain the core of the Byzantine Empire as the point of attraction of many peoples, in fact still from also across the frontiers, but in small numbers it could be diluted, right, in forces where, again, altogether, as we'll see, just with these Aryans, the foreign element, even though those were within the empire itself, was so, but definitely not the refined kind of Byzantine one, right? It were wild barbarians from the Anatolian hinterland, could say remain compact and under the direct control of Constantinople, so not depending on the relation with an external people that would make also provide with the records for the army just per se, right? That would continue as a concept, but if the empire strived successfully not to make it a dangerous dynamic, but something more manageable, right? And that's why also international policy, as we'll see, was crucial. And so what we think of the Byzantine diplomacy as a civilizational masterpiece, well, that began in many ways here. Already the Romans were good at it, but let's say the needs of Constantinople were also kind of greater, because very often the situation was more desperate and more threatening than it seemed. So in this, Constantinople functionalized dramatically and with, as you know, clamorous success, considering for how long the empire lasted, even though half and practically, and beyond, as you know, even more. This reform, this essentially financial reform and paying reforms, right? This was a bit like it's what you have always to keep in mind. It's like the Marian one, right? People think that it was, I don't know, a systematic engineering of the Roman army that was remolded. No, the Roman army basically remained completely untouched. Marius or these other reformers didn't change even a single element of the Roman army from an organizational, tactical, technical point of view. The army remained identical, the same. It was evolving by itself. Nobody needed to change anything. What these reforms were essentially political, right? It was about, being paid, right? Having a state that retakes control on that vital connection. And that's why the Byzantine army would remain, even as we were saying before, now during the 6th century, so heterogeneous, right, in faith, and still relying on the federati, but still in a way that the bulk of the army was under safer control of the state. And this naturally allowed also to maintain numbers and capacities on a good level, right? Where especially, even though this direct, say, reliance on the barbarian element was decreasing, still was possible to engineer at that point, for example, a greater training level with all what was available by itself, right? That sophisticated, refined Byzantine military art that we read from the Strategicon, from the peak of what has been Byzantine civilization, exactly in the 6th century, would increase, for example, and especially the quality, right? For example, the amount of training, the amount of weapons which recruits were normally, in fact, practicing with, and in fact, it was not even a huge army, right? As you know, demographic resources would have not allowed it in the first place, but exactly because of that, the Byzantines thought, well, that it was better to increase the quality after all. It was not important to have a huge army. It was important to have a compact army with a very high quality rate of training, so that it could these forces could rely on themselves, on greater esprit de corps, this awareness that they were the best and that this military culture was essentially the superior one on the other peoples, from which it drew also its, as we've seen, its secrets, elements, techniques, armaments, the same individuals that were enlisted in the army, but making it thus again something, a good option, right? Something to look for, right? Enlisted in it and receiving that pay, and being pampered, let's say, by the state by a certain degree. Of course, life was brutal. There was also a private system that is developing, right? The Justinian times, as you know, see the also an increase in say hierarchization, privatization, in spite of the efforts of public let's say of centralization by a certain degree. But we were talking about it the other day, speaking of Justinian's reforms, the Justinian reforms, that is to say, let's control a fewer guys, but that control kind of more locally, so that we have hopefully a more direct influence on the dynamic. Think about the bucellari as private retinues of provincial magnates that would integrate this force within the permanent army. So towards, again, even their professionalization with a dynamic that is not that different from a sort of proto-feudalism that the early Middle Ages, also in Western Europe, begins to take shape, with the idea that there is the guy on horseback for which the peasants work, and that they can avoid military service in exchange for just being under him. And so this is an important stabilizing maneuver as well. So undoubtedly, this phase, first of suffered settlement and eventually of rebirth, of coming back of the Byzantine Empire, lived under Zeno and during the first part of Anastasius' reign, had been favored also and significantly by a period of substantial calm on the borders, without which you can't really make fancy financial reforms and adapting, because it's not that Anastasius was just the genius, taking out the rabbit from the hat. That was a moment of relative calm that had to be exploited. Less expenses, more stability, people just, thinking at the future more brightly, say, making more children and making trade functioning better, work being kind of more the longer range investment, and so on. So at the beginning of the 6th century, however, the strategic situation began again to complicate itself. And again, this is normality considering those times. It's not normal, however, to have to do with a parallel empire like the Sassanian one, right, which is not quite like the barbarian groups in the West. In fact, after 60 years of relative calm, because everything always happens on these frontiers, the Persian one came back to be critical in 502, when the Sassanians, in fact, attacked Syria. The war lasted for 4 years, and it terminated with a Roman counteroffensive that re-equilibrated the situation. But still, by that point, one of the main, say, hotbeds of tension within the entire history of the Roman Empire had come back to be lightened up. Anastasius was obliged to reinforce the defenses of some key cities and in the border fortifications in the area by and building also the new and famous fortified city of Daras, that would remain, in fact, one of the most significant strategic strongholds in the history of the Byzantine Sassanian wars. So strengthening a bit also the impermeability of the borders, because the Sassanians were developing as an empire, as far as especially as their Mesopotamian state was concerned. Again, that was kind of the civilized, kind of militarily statal area, whereas the Iranian plateau was much more feudal in nature. In the north there were also these problems. I don't know, the Sassanians had to deal with the white Huns, where the Europeans with the black ones, and still the Iranian origins of the people from the steppes still kind of winked at the settlement of other barbarian groups in the north, also to counterbalance from Mesopotamia that from in fact the more statal rule, that feudal nobility of the Iranian plateau, and so on, this kind of gaming. But there were lots of war bands, you can even argue, that could escape the control of the Sassanians, right? Horsemen of the steppes, etc. We tend to stress these things mostly for the Middle Ages and this broader Persianized, Turkic, eventually Mongol area. Always these peoples coming from everywhere, riding, pillaging. But the ancient world, the Persian one, was similar in many ways. So this naturally tormented the Roman frontier by a certain degree, and the main problem being that the Sassanians had actually a hell of an army, a professional one and statal one as well, that formed the bulk of the of their forces, surrounded by these auxiliary ones. And as you know, the Persians were the most threatening foe that the empire ever met. Right, the Germans also didn't kid, especially ever since they had compacted in confederacies. They had partially Romanized their warfare as well. But they were divided, generally speaking, as we've just seen. Instead, the Persians were really something. They had their own problems, just like the Byzantines, but were a terrible foe. And it's likely that in this circumstance, also the payment of a periodic tribute to the Persians was established, right? This was a normal measure. Everybody used it, but the permanent nature of some, and just the habituality and the necessity, right, of resorting to such mean was affirming imposingly in Byzantine foreign policy, exactly because of this tumultuous surroundings of the empire. The peace that had been signed thus was built on a situation of substantial balance, but because of this tribute the Romans paid to the Sassanians, it entailed essentially not completely favorable terms to the Byzantines, and it stimulated a remarkable work of consolidation of the defensive structure as well, in the anticipation of further Persian offensives. A similar type of situation was not completely coherent with the Roman traditions of the early Middle Empire, right? When the point of the empire was substantially crushing directly any form of enemy by annihilating him, right, and imposing, right, having the upper hand on these peoples when they were subjugated, that had not been wiped out. These were not the times which, both in moral and material terms, the empire could afford to do the same with its surroundings. So such radical changes that had occurred starting especially from the late 3rd century, where also the stabilization of a real bureaucratic state, etc., show the necessity to change properly the entire foreign policy in a way, and consequently strategy. And by the 6th century, we see a bit like the peak of such vital and inescapable necessity. the empire was smaller, the enemies were more and more compact, also due to the same Romanization, right? There is those who say that objectively that the Germans and the Sassanians improved their militaries because of Roman turncoats, and there is direct evidence of this, especially in the case of the Sassanians. The Parthians were ridiculized in the ancient world because of their lack of siege capabilities, whereas the Sassanians were a hell of a force regarding that, and it said that it was basically the Romano-Hellenistic polytheistic tradition that made that happen. And Rome was still the stronger power, so we shouldn't overstate, in this kind of Western, paranoid idea towards the undefeatable Eastern Oriental enemy. This is so dangerous. No, the Constantinople was the stronger power, and they knew that. Just that even smaller powers, as the Federati had showed, could strike really at the Schwerpunkt, and so nobody is invincible really, and that doesn't mean having kind of a sclerotic, categorical, hypostatic view of who's the strongest, so that has as always to win. No, war is unpredictable in many ways. In fact, the Romans played with Persia similarly, right? Surely there was a lot going on in terms of proxy wars, rebellions, and that Byzantine political institutional culture, not even just the military one, was to be heavily influenced by Persia, right? At this point, if you look at the coins of the solidity of, say, Anastasius or Justinian, they look still like that kind of Roman, kind of Western. Now, in a few generations, by the time of Heraclius, maybe not a few generations, but still, though, you have something that looks pretty weird. And you understand, if you look at the Middle Eastern coins, etc., it looks pretty dramatically close to that. So there is also an important cultural identity change in the Byzantine Empire at this point that perhaps we will talk about on another occasion. But it did affect the same army, the one that we know from later times. And so the enemies of the empire, as we've just seen, had become threatening on multiple fronts, and the military resources were very often insufficient to the contemporary management of all the critical areas. And the enemies knew that, right? They weren't waiting for the Romans to feel comfy and ready for okay, let's concentrate on this critical area. No, they would try to hit all at a time, as we were saying also in that video about Scot-Irish attacks on Roman Britain in the 4th century. That brought to the same abandonment of the province, like in a few decades. I mean, not really that one. It was an internal thing to the empire, but seeing how, of course, the enemies of the empire knew how to coordinate dramatically well. So the Roman authorities had well understood the dynamic of the barbarian peoples from quite a while, like these migrations in Central Eastern Europe, originating from Central Asia, etc., arrived to pressure the frontiers, due again to this kind of domino effect that one population pushing another and the other pushing the other again until they arrived to the Roman frontier. And so there was this pressure and attrition, and the entire Gothic problem had began like that. But it had been normal in many ways. I mean, the Romans up to the late 4th century had normally absorbed all these waves and either exterminated or relocated these peoples, deported them, resettled them, etc. So the main problem now, given that lots of things were going on in Eurasia, is that even after having, assuming that you could exterminate one people, they would never do it at this point because, again, they needed manpower and labor force. So any prisoner taken was a good new subject, colonist, or soldier, right, to use. That's where the Roman army really, and Roman state in general, still really displayed its own capacity. But even having absorbed destroyed one people, but the Roman imperial forces that would have to have fight a war, so suffered losses and having committed huge resources from throughout all the empire for the campaign and so on. After a while, the strategic situation came back to be critical because the next group that had been pushed towards the west again took the place of the removed one, and the pressure on the frontiers came back to increase. So in practice, the looking for the definitive destruction of a barbarian group had enormous costs in terms of your own military resources, but inconsistent advantages on the longer run, because it simply led to the substitution of a threat by another, and to the necessity of starting over in the management of the situation, and with ever less resources that you would have consumed significantly during the war. So this context in which the Roman Empire found itself ever more immersed between the 5th and the 6th century, and triggering all these mechanisms, including the evaporation of the West, and this change in politics and strategy of the East, entailed the absolute necessity to adapt in a flexible way to the situation, penalty being overwhelmed by it. It became thus of primary importance to lead, say, contained and therefore scarcely costly campaigns in terms of resources, shifting the objective from the annihilation of the enemy to its mere containment, and all aimed at the eventual management by diplomatic way that became ever more important, right? An enemy, a contained enemy, and brought to a situation of balance with arms could be brought to non-belligerence and transformed in a defensive buffer state extra limites, that is to say, outside of Roman territory, or even turned, as we've seen, as it had happened with this shifting of the Goths toward the west, towards other, not necessarily ethnic groups. It would happen in some other situation, not this one, but at least other polities, other places that could, help Byzantine policy. And this naturally was carried out not through some kind of, okay, let's trick them and they will go wherever we want. They had to pay a freaking lot of money, right? Tributes, as we were saying now, were generally the normal, were the gold standard, quite literally, for this. And it costed a lot, but it costed much less than a war normally. And naturally, everybody knew at the time, like if you had been in charge in the government of these, these offices in charge of diplomatic relations and payment of tributes, would have kind of known how to dimension the costs of a war against these people versus the ones that the influence that a tribute could achieve. And naturally, there was a debate about this because the empire kept making wars and kept pushing away peoples, etc. But everything happens by various degrees, and you have to understand when and how to do it. And it's always remember that, after all, these peoples coming from the steppes were not aimed all at, they were not motivated all to destroy the empire, right? Ideally, everybody would have liked to take power everywhere, because this is the only thing that humans do, essentially, in the history of mankind, just because we're programmed like that. But some probably couldn't, right? Think about just the Theodosian walls that resisted up to the gunpowder against some very, threatening foes and effective armies of theirs think about the Avars, think about the Arabs, etc. So we're talking about peoples that would have seized Constantinople and ruled from there, probably. So the empire did need to have those pushing away capacities, but most peoples just didn't have those capacities at all, and they were just content to dwell around the empire that after all was recognized everywhere as the empire, right? The other only empire, like every power, yes, thought to have a degree of universal ecumenic force, but in practice the influence of Constantinople and of the Byzantine Empire was enormous. As I often say, like even in 10th century Britain, there were some Anglo-Saxon kings that styled themselves as basileus, right? Not as imperator even. So everybody knew, the Scandinavians knew, the Ethiopians knew, the Sinds knew that was the empire. But there were other powers around, but they all fundamentally gravitated around Constantinople. And this broader idea of Romanity that lived on in Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond. So there was not that compartmentalized idea of, okay, here I begin and you end, right? Because it's the same ecumenic ideal that forbids that. What kind of ecumenic power is the one that doesn't want to take over the world entire, right? What kind of moral forces can you put together if you just reduce that idea, right? That's why we're not capable of doing this anymore, because we're disgusting, simply. And people are obsessed with imperialism and all these terrible things. Well, yeah, we're terrified by imperialism if there are freaking underdeveloped peoples who are not even capable of making war. In the APC of strategy. But if there were a dramatic civilization taking over the world, superior to everyone, we would all be kind of, maybe not all happy, but still, things would be much better in general. The point being that the question at the time was broken already, because the empire had been severed, as we've seen, and even the Justinian reconquest wouldn't actually restore the Roman Empire to its great extent. That was still the aim, at least formally, or legalistically, because that's what the Byzantines came up with by sclerotizing a bit, apostatizing a bit their own concept of themselves in a bit of an Hellenic way, to say, at least everything that Rome had once controlled from Scotland to the Persian Gulf was legally Roman, because it had been Roman, right? An ancient Roman would have thought more like, everything is Roman because Romans simply want to conquer it, which sounds much better, frankly. In any case, the latter, legalism, does reflect also this emphasis on diplomacy that was, carefully developed at the time, also to cope with these other peoples, not triggering them, enough regarding who was who, right? You think all the ambiguities later on with the Bulgarian Tsars, the blending with the empire, all visions that reflect the limits, naturally, of the same imperial power at the time. So compared to the Roman tradition, in the 6th century, there was at this point a sort of, preference towards the negotiation. Because again, if you're not the strongest one anymore, in absolute terms, where like in the early Roman Empire, when de facto there was no threat at the frontiers, because all other peoples were kind of, not a power fundamentally, or one capable of inflicting Rome any significant systemic damage. This base concept of the preservation of resources, containment, and diplomacy were needed for any kind of relation, from the barbarian groups to other ecumenic empires like the Sassanian ones, etc. And this kind of international attitude and strategic practice was observed, if you look at it, basically by all the 6th century and early 7th century emperors, right? And in the rare circumstances in which there was also only partially a diversion from this line, the negative consequences didn't take long to manifest, actually, and so even the Saint Justinian reconquest was this very big shot to say, okay, we will not compromise, we'll take over everything. As you know, I'm sympathetic towards actually the strategic choice of it. It sounded sound, in fact, and it didn't. If it backfired on the long run, it's because also pretty big, unpredictable things that we can't predict, just like we're seeing today as well, were happening after centuries. By the way, like a major pandemic, for example, that was much more seriously impacting at the time, of course, than anything we see today, but still, for today, significantly to see how much more impacting on a system like that one could have been, right? With the delicacy of corrupt rates in pre-industrial societies, with just the need of manpower, labor forces, we were saying before. So it was about seizing the opportunity at the moment, right? And it was a gamble, but still, it was an important gamble, right? Because just think even about the Arab invasions when Constantinople lost one half of its territory at that point. Well, the guys still had parts of Italy. They still had extended their control on other areas. If they had not done that in Justinian times, it would have been even worse, right? Or maybe, I don't know, it would have been better, but still with more absolute force. So as a kind of a greater gamble than probably. So history is unpredictable, but certain factors do improve or, kind of make the things more difficult. So, as we know, in 518, Justin succeeded to Anastasius. Justin was a military man. He had just done that career, so he didn't really fit a role of such, statal political importance. But this opened eventually to the fundamental, the key character in Byzantine history, that is his nephew and adoptive son, Justinian. Alright, so for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.